There are moments in history when fear doesn't arrive with explosions or headlines, but with silence, the kind that spreads when people lower their voices, avoid names, and look over their shoulders before finishing a sentence. In Northern Ireland, during the later years of the Troubles, one such name carried that silence with it. Billy King Rat Wright didn't need public speeches or political offices to command attention. His reputation alone was enough to control territory, shape loyalties, and unsettle even those who claimed to stand on the same side. This is the story of how one man rose to become the most feared Loyalist commander in mid-Ulster, not through ideology alone, but through authority, control, and an iron grip on those around him. Billy Wright emerged from a region already hardened by decades of division, where identity and allegiance defined daily life. In mid-Ulster, Loyalist communities were tightly knit, deeply suspicious of outsiders, and shaped by a constant sense of threat. Wright understood this environment instinctively. He projected certainty in a world full of doubt and offered clarity in a conflict where lines were often blurred. From early on, he cultivated an image of decisiveness, presenting himself as someone who would act when others hesitated. That image would become the foundation of his power. Unlike political figures who sought legitimacy through negotiation or public support, Wright built influence through personal authority. He positioned himself as a commander rather than a spokesperson, someone who enforced discipline and loyalty within his ranks. People around him described a man who demanded obedience and rewarded compliance, creating a structure that depended less on formal hierarchy and more on fear and respect. In Loyalist areas, this approach resonated with those who felt abandoned or ignored by broader political developments. As ceasefires and peace talks began reshaping Northern Ireland, Wright's stance set him apart. While many Loyalist groups moved cautiously toward political engagement, he viewed compromise as weakness. This refusal to adapt elevated his profile among hardliners, but deepened divisions within Loyalism itself. His uncompromising position turned him into a symbol, to some of resistance, to others of recklessness. Either way, his influence grew. The nickname King Rat was not self-chosen, but it stuck because it captured how people perceived him. He was seen as someone who dominated his territory completely, controlling movements, decisions, and outcomes. In mid-Ulster, his word carried weight not because of formal authority, but because of what people believed would happen if they defied him. This perception alone reshaped behavior. Silence became a survival strategy. Distance became safety. Wright's rise was also marked by his ability to navigate rivalries. Loyalism was never a single unified force. It was fractured, competitive, and often internally hostile. Wright understood these dynamics and exploited them. He challenged rival commanders, questioned leadership decisions, and positioned himself as the alternative to what he portrayed as weakening authority. This approach did not isolate him, it amplified him. Conflict within Loyalism drew attention to his defiance and reinforced his reputation as someone unwilling to bend. At the same time, Wright became a figure of intense interest to authorities. His name appeared repeatedly in intelligence briefings, security assessments, and internal reports. He was monitored not only because of what he represented, but because of what he could destabilize. A single decision from him had the potential to trigger wider consequences. This constant surveillance added another layer to his myth. Being watched, yet still operating, reinforced the idea that he was untouchable. What made Wright particularly dangerous in the eyes of many observers was not just his influence, but his predictability. He was consistent in his refusal to compromise, consistent in his methods, and consistent in projecting strength. In a conflict defined by uncertainty, this consistency created fear. People knew what he stood for, even if they didn't know what he would do next. Within Loyalist communities, opinions about Wright were complex. Some viewed him as a defender of identity, someone who refused to abandon principles in the face of political pressure. Others saw him as a liability, a man whose actions threatened to undermine fragile progress. These conflicting views rarely surfaced openly. Speaking critically of Wright carried risks, and so conversations often ended before they truly began. As his power grew, so did his isolation. Leaders who rely on fear often find themselves surrounded by compliance rather than honesty. Decisions are affirmed, not questioned. Over time, this creates an echo chamber where perceived strength replaces strategic judgment. Wright's authority remained firm, but the space around him narrowed. Allies became cautious, rivals became patient. Everyone watched. By the time Wright's dominance reached its peak, he had become more than an individual. He was a symbol of defiance against change. His presence complicated peace efforts and intensified Loyalist fragmentation. Yet, despite his visibility, the true extent of his vulnerability was not immediately obvious. Power, when built on reputation alone, can appear solid even as its foundations weaken. This first chapter of Billy Wright's story is not about a single act or moment, but about atmosphere, about how fear can function as currency, about how authority can exist without official titles, and about how in a deeply divided society, one individual can shape behavior simply by being spoken of in whispers. Wright did not seize power through public platforms or popular vote. He acquired it through control, perception, and the belief that resistance was futile. In the end, his rise tells us as much about the environment that allowed it as it does about the man himself. Mid-Ulster was fertile ground for figures who promised certainty in uncertain times. Billy King Rat Wright stepped into that space, filled it completely, and ruled it through presence alone. What followed would shock the entire region, but long before that moment, the fear that defined his rule had already left its mark.
What followed next was not a gradual shift, but a deliberate break that would redefine Loyalism's internal landscape. Billy Wright did not merely disagree with existing leadership, he rejected it outright. As ceasefires reshaped the political direction of Northern Ireland, many Loyalist organizations faced an uncomfortable transition from armed struggle toward negotiation and restraint. For Wright, this transition felt like surrender. He viewed compromise as betrayal and believed that authority earned through confrontation should never be diluted by political calculation. This belief placed him on a collision course with the very movement that had enabled his rise. Tensions between Wright and senior figures within the Ulster Volunteer Force intensified as peace initiatives gained momentum. Where others spoke of strategy and long-term stability, Wright spoke in absolutes. He framed the ceasefire not as a tactical pause, but as a loss of purpose. In his view, Loyalism was being redirected by people who no longer understood the communities they claimed to represent. These disagreements were not confined to private meetings. They spilled into open defiance, making reconciliation impossible. The split that followed was not a spontaneous rebellion, but a calculated separation. Wright gathered those who shared his uncompromising outlook, individuals who believed that Loyalism should remain confrontational and unapologetic. From this group, the Loyalist Volunteer Force emerged. The LVF was not presented as an alternative voice within Loyalism, but as a corrective force. Wright positioned it as a return to discipline and clarity, rejecting what he portrayed as dilution and weakness elsewhere. The formation of the LVF deepened fractures that already existed. Loyalism had always been divided by personalities, territory, and ideology, but Wright's move turned disagreement into open rivalry. Former allies became adversaries. Areas once united by shared identity became contested spaces of influence. Wright's refusal to acknowledge the authority of established leadership made coexistence impossible. In doing so, he transformed Loyalism from a fractured movement into an openly hostile environment. What distinguished the LVF under Wright's leadership was its tone. It was defined less by numbers and more by posture. Wright projected the group as decisive, disciplined, and intolerant of dissent. Internally, loyalty was absolute. Externally, the message was clear. The LVF would not be guided by negotiations, political timelines, or external pressure. This uncompromising stance attracted attention disproportionate to the group's size. Influence, once again, outweighed scale. Rival Loyalist factions viewed the LVF as a destabilizing force. Wright's actions challenged not just strategy, but legitimacy. By breaking away, he questioned who had the right to speak for Loyalist communities. This question had no easy answer, and that uncertainty intensified internal tensions. Leadership disputes that might once have been settled quietly now played out publicly, with Wright at the center. Authorities watching from the outside recognized the danger of this fragmentation. Internal conflict within Loyalism threatened to undermine fragile progress and introduce unpredictability into an already volatile situation. Wright's defiance complicated security planning because it disrupted assumptions. Agreements made with one group no longer applied universally. Control became fragmented and responsibility blurred. For Wright, however, isolation was not a weakness. It reinforced his identity as an outsider to compromise. The LVF's existence validated his belief that Loyalism had lost its way and needed correction. Each criticism from rival factions strengthened his narrative. Each attempt to marginalize him confirmed in his mind that he stood alone against dilution and decay. Yet this defiance came at a cost. By positioning himself against both rival Loyalists and the broader political direction, Wright narrowed his options. Alliances weakened, support became conditional. Even among sympathizers, doubts surfaced about sustainability. Power based on refusal can command attention, but it struggles to adapt. As the LVF asserted itself, Wright's visibility increased dramatically. He was no longer just a regional commander, he was a symbol of internal resistance. This made him harder to ignore and easier to target politically and strategically. His name appeared more frequently in public discourse, often as an obstacle to peace. The myth surrounding him grew, but so did scrutiny. Within Loyalist communities, reactions were mixed and often silent. Some saw the LVF as a necessary stand against compromise they didn't trust. Others feared that Wright's rigidity would bring consequences they could not control. These debates rarely unfolded openly. Fear of division, reprisal, or isolation kept many opinions unspoken. The result was an atmosphere of quiet tension, where uncertainty replaced unity. Wright's leadership style during this period remained consistent, firm, centralized, and intolerant of challenge. Decisions flowed from him alone. The LVF was structured around his authority, not collective deliberation. This made the group agile, but also dependent. Without Wright, there was no clear mechanism for balance or restraint. Everything revolved around his presence. As the months passed, the LVF's existence hardened divisions within Loyalism to the point of irreversibility. What began as ideological disagreement became structural separation. Trust eroded, communication collapsed, the possibility of reconciliation faded. Wright had not only broken away, he had altered the Loyalist landscape permanently. By this stage, Billy Wright stood apart from every major force around him. He was opposed by rival Loyalists, rejected by the political process, monitored by authorities, and identified by opponents as a symbol of defiance. His power remained real, but increasingly brittle. The LVF gave him a platform, but it also boxed him in.
This chapter of the story reveals how leadership rooted in absolutes can redefine an entire movement, but at the cost of isolation. Wright's creation of the Loyalist volunteer force was not just an organizational decision, it was a statement of identity. It announced that he would not bend even as the world around him changed. And in making that choice, he set in motion forces that would ultimately shape the final chapters of his story. Forces that no amount of authority or reputation could fully control.
From that moment on, Billy Wright existed in a state of constant observation, a figure watched from multiple directions at once. Few individuals during the later years of the Troubles attracted such sustained attention from so many opposing forces. Republican militants viewed him as a high-profile Loyalist symbol. Rival Loyalist factions regarded him as a destabilizing threat. British security services monitored him as a man capable of derailing fragile progress. Wright was not just surrounded by enemies, he was surrounded by interest. Every move he made carried potential consequences far beyond his immediate circle. This level of scrutiny reshaped how Wright operated. Visibility became unavoidable. His reputation meant that even minor decisions were interpreted as signals. Silence could be read as intent. Absence could spark rumors. In a climate like Northern Ireland's, perception mattered as much as reality. Wright understood this and leaned into it, projecting confidence even as the pressure mounted. Being watched, in his mind, reinforced his importance. It confirmed that he still mattered in a changing political landscape. For British intelligence, Wright presented a complex problem. On one hand, he represented continuity, a known figure with predictable views. On the other, his refusal to engage with ceasefires introduced unpredictability. Security planners rely on assumptions, and Wright disrupted those assumptions simply by existing outside consensus. Monitoring him became a necessity, not because he was invisible, but because he was so visible that his actions could ripple outward. This constant surveillance was not cinematic or dramatic. It unfolded through reports, assessments, and quiet coordination. Wright's movements were tracked, his associations were noted, his statements were analyzed for intent. Yet, despite this scrutiny, Wright remained difficult to contain. He operated in spaces where authority was informal and loyalty personal. Surveillance could observe, but it could not reshape his influence. At the same time, Republican groups saw Wright less as an individual and more as a symbol. Symbols carry weight because they condense complex conflicts into recognizable figures. Wright's defiance of the peace process made him emblematic of resistance to change. This symbolic status elevated him beyond regional influence, placing him into a broader narrative of conflict. It also meant that his presence carried risks not just for himself, but for those around him. Ironically, being targeted from so many angles created a sense of inevitability around Wright's future. Allies worried privately that his profile made him vulnerable. Rivals believed time would eventually corner him. Authorities recognized that sustained tension rarely resolves quietly. Yet Wright himself appeared unmoved by these concerns. He continued to project authority, reinforcing the image that he was insulated by reputation alone. This period marked a subtle shift in how Wright related to power. Earlier, control had come from dominance within Loyalist spaces. Now, it also came from how others reacted to him. He no longer needed to assert himself constantly. His name did the work. That kind of influence can be intoxicating. It can also be misleading. When attention replaces support, power becomes fragile without appearing so. Within Loyalist communities, Wright's position grew increasingly uncomfortable. People felt caught between fear of him and fear of what his presence might invoke. Conversations became more guarded. Neutrality became harder to maintain. Wright's shadow stretched far beyond his immediate followers, shaping behavior even among those who wanted distance from him. This silent influence was perhaps his greatest strength and his greatest risk. British authorities faced criticism from multiple sides during this time. Some accused them of allowing figures like Wright too much space. Others argued that direct intervention would only elevate his status further.
This dilemma defined much of the approach toward him. Containment rather than confrontation became the strategy. Watch closely, record everything, avoid turning him into a martyr or rallying point. Wright's awareness of being watched added another layer to his persona. He often spoke and acted as someone who believed history was watching too. His actions carried an air of permanence, as though he expected to be remembered. This sense of historical awareness reinforced his rigidity. Compromise in that mindset felt like erasure. Yet constant scrutiny also isolates. The more Wright became a subject of analysis, the less room there was for ordinary human interaction. Trust narrowed. Information became filtered. Those around him adjusted what they said and did, conscious that everything might be noted, interpreted, or misinterpreted. Power thrives on information, but it withers when information becomes scarce. As time passed, Wright's environment grew tighter. Surveillance did not weaken his authority directly, but it reduced his flexibility. Every option carried risk. Every association was scrutinized. The space for maneuvering shrank. In this way, being watched by everyone slowly transformed from a symbol of importance into a constraint. This stage of Wright's story is defined by tension rather than action. It is the tension of being central and isolated at the same time, of commanding fear while lacking freedom, of being seen as powerful while becoming increasingly exposed. The forces surrounding him were patient. They did not need to act quickly. The pressure alone was shaping outcomes. By the end of this phase, Billy Wright stood at a crossroads created not by a single decision, but accumulated attention. He had become a focal point in a conflict that was trying to move forward without him. His refusal to change kept him relevant, but it also ensured that he remained surrounded. Watched by allies, rivals, and authorities alike, Wright occupied a shrinking space where reputation could no longer guarantee safety. This constant observation set the stage for what would come next. When everyone is watching, nothing stays hidden for long. The system around Wright was tightening, not through force, but through inevitability. And while he continued to project control, the reality was that the margin for error had all but disappeared.
That tightening pressure eventually led to a place that was supposed to neutralize risk entirely. When Billy Wright was sent to the Maze prison, also known as Long Quiche, many believed the story had entered a controlled phase. The prison was designed to contain the most influential figures of the conflict, separating them from the outside world and from one another. For authorities, incarceration was meant to limit influence, reduce volatility, and impose boundaries that reputation alone could not override. For Wright, it was a forced transition into a space where power operated under very different rules. Inside the Maze, Wright was placed in a high-security unit reserved for Loyalist prisoners. The assumption was simple: separation would prevent confrontation, and strict controls would ensure order. On paper, the system appeared airtight. Movement was regulated, access points were monitored, procedures were documented. The prison represented the state's confidence in structure and protocol. Yet history has a way of exposing the gap between design and reality. Wright did not arrive as an anonymous inmate. His reputation followed him through the gates. Within the prison environment, identity still mattered. Influence did not disappear, it adapted. Wright remained a symbolic figure, discussed, observed, and assessed by prisoners and staff alike. His presence carried meaning beyond his cell. For some, he represented defiance. For others, a reminder of unresolved tensions that even walls could not erase. What made the Maze unique was not just its security, but its population. Individuals from opposing sides of the conflict were held within the same complex, separated by design, but connected by proximity. This created an environment where history, grievance, and symbolism coexisted under constant supervision. The prison was not merely a holding facility. It was a compressed version of the conflict itself, managed through routines and regulations. Authorities believed they understood the risks. Wright was monitored. His movements were restricted. Security assessments were conducted. Yet institutions, no matter how experienced, rely on assumptions. One of those assumptions was that the internal controls were sufficient to prevent the unthinkable. That belief would soon be tested. The event that followed shocked not only Northern Ireland, but observers far beyond it. Despite the layers of security, Wright was killed within the prison by members of the Irish National Liberation Army who were also incarcerated there. The fact that such an act could occur in what was considered a secure environment immediately raised profound questions. How did opposing prisoners gain access? How did procedures fail? And perhaps most unsettling of all, was this a failure of design, execution, or oversight? The reaction was immediate and intense. Political leaders, human rights groups, and international observers demanded answers. The prison, once presented as a symbol of control, now appeared vulnerable. The focus shifted from Wright himself to the system that was supposed to manage him. Attention turned to logs, schedules, staffing decisions, and communication failures. The narrative was no longer about a single individual, but about institutional responsibility. For Loyalist communities, the killing carried deep emotional weight. Regardless of opinions about Wright's leadership, the idea that a high-profile figure could be killed while under state custody triggered anger and suspicion. Questions spread quickly. Was this preventable? Was it negligence? Or had someone allowed it to happen? These questions did not require answers to gain traction. The uncertainty alone was enough to inflame tensions. Authorities were careful in their response. Statements emphasized complexity, ongoing investigations, and the need for calm. Yet the damage to confidence was already done. Prisons are built on trust in systems, trust that procedures will function as intended. When that trust breaks, restoring it becomes far more difficult than maintaining it in the first place. Multiple inquiries followed, each examining different aspects of the case. Security protocols were dissected in detail. Decisions were reviewed line by line. The focus was not just on what happened, but on how assumptions had shaped outcomes. Inquiries explored whether warnings had been missed, whether risks were underestimated, and whether institutional culture had contributed to complacency. What made the case particularly controversial was that it resisted simple explanations. There was no single failure that could be isolated and corrected. Instead, the picture that emerged was one of cumulative weakness, small decisions, routine practices, and overlooked signals combining into a moment of irreversible consequence. This complexity fueled ongoing debate and speculation. For many, the most troubling aspect was the lingering suspicion that the system had not merely failed, but been compromised. Allegations of collusion or deliberate neglect surfaced repeatedly, even when official findings rejected them. These suspicions persisted because they fit the broader history of mistrust that defined the conflict. In a society shaped by secrecy and contested narratives, official conclusions rarely closed debate. Wright's death inside the maze transformed his legacy instantly. He was no longer just a controversial leader, he became a focal point for arguments about state responsibility, prisoner management, and the limits of control. His killing shifted attention away from his actions and toward the environment that allowed it to occur. In doing so, it extended his influence beyond life, embedding him into institutional and political discourse. Internationally, the case drew scrutiny because it intersected with human rights obligations. States have a duty to protect those in their custody, regardless of who they are or what they represent. The failure to do so carries consequences not just legally, but morally. The maze incident became a case study cited in discussions about prison management in conflict settings, reinforcing how difficult neutrality becomes when history weighs heavily on every decision. Within the prison system, changes followed. Procedures were reviewed. Risk assessments were tightened. The lesson was not lost. Separation and security are not static solutions. They require constant reevaluation, especially when dealing with figures whose symbolic value amplifies risk. Wright's case underscored that reputation does not dissolve behind bars. It can in fact become more dangerous. This chapter of the story stands apart because it shattered assumptions on all sides. Loyalists questioned protection. Authorities questioned procedure. Observers questioned certainty. The maze prison, once a symbol of containment, became a reminder that even the most controlled environments are vulnerable to human error and structural blind spots. As the immediate shock faded, the long-term implications remained. Wright's death did not end debate, it intensified it. It did not simplify narratives, it complicated them. And it ensured that the story of Billy King Rat Wright would not be confined to the streets of Mid-Ulster or the politics of loyalism, but would be permanently linked to one of the most serious institutional failures of the conflict,
a moment when control gave way to consequence, and the entire system was forced to confront its limits.
The aftermath of Billy Wright's death in the Maze prison was as complex as the man himself, and its consequences rippled far beyond the walls where he was killed. Almost immediately, the killing became a focal point for political debate, media scrutiny, and loyalist reflection. Wright had been a figure whose influence had spanned both formal and informal structures of loyalism. Now, even in death, that influence persisted, albeit in altered forms. His absence left a vacuum, not only in the LVF's command structure, but also in the symbolic hierarchy that he had dominated for years. Communities that had once viewed him as a guardian, a figure of unwavering defiance, now had to grapple with uncertainty. Leadership, loyalty, and direction all became contested and unstable. The official inquiries into his death consumed attention for years. These investigations examined every possible factor: prison procedures, intelligence reporting, staffing decisions, and interactions among prisoners. The scrutiny was exhaustive because Wright's killing represented a failure of trust, one that affected not just the immediate parties involved, but the broader perception of security and governance in Northern Ireland. The Maze prison was meant to enforce control, to separate rival factions, and to prevent violence. That it failed so dramatically was a shock to authorities, and it forced an uncomfortable reckoning about the limits of control, even in a highly monitored environment. The inquiries were accompanied by a swirl of speculation and suspicion. Loyalist communities, already steeped in narratives of betrayal and collusion, were quick to question whether inside help had facilitated the killing. These allegations were never fully proven, yet they persisted, creating a legacy of distrust toward institutions. Every subsequent assessment of Northern Ireland's prison management or loyalist oversight had to contend with this shadow. Wright's death became a touchstone, an example repeatedly cited in discussions of how symbolic figures can be vulnerable, even when under the strictest containment. For the Loyalist volunteer force, the loss of Wright was both destabilizing and defining. On one hand, the organization had been heavily dependent on his leadership style, centralized, decisive, and uncompromising. Without his presence, decision-making became fragmented, and authority within the LVF was contested. On the other hand, Wright's death also became a rallying point, a symbol that perpetuated the group's identity. His martyrdom, perceived or real, reinforced the ideological rigidity of the LVF, while simultaneously limiting its operational flexibility. Wright's absence forced a recalibration of internal dynamics, but his legacy continued to shape loyalty, hierarchy, and rhetoric. The broader Loyalist movement experienced a similar shock. Wright's uncompromising stance and defiance of the peace process had already created divisions. In death, those divisions hardened. Some factions used his killing as justification for continued resistance, framing it as evidence that compromise would never be enough to protect their own. Others saw it as proof that isolation and rigidity could be fatal. The tension between these interpretations reflected the ongoing struggle within loyalism to reconcile history, identity, and strategy. Wright's life and death became a lens through which these debates were continuously filtered. Political and social observers outside loyalist communities also took note. Wright's story highlighted the challenges of managing high-profile figures in post-conflict environments. It revealed how prisons, intelligence operations, and institutional frameworks can be overwhelmed not just by violence, but by symbolism. The Maze prison killing became a case study in risk management, accountability, and the unintended consequences of isolation. Lessons drawn from the incident influenced policies, operational procedures, and public discourse around security and detention in conflict zones worldwide. Media coverage played a significant role in shaping Wright's posthumous legacy. Reporting focused on the dramatic aspects of the killing, the notoriety of the figure involved, and the institutional failures surrounding it. This coverage amplified his symbolic status. He was no longer just a leader of a paramilitary group. He became an enduring reference point in discussions of Loyalist politics, prison security, and the broader troubles. Public perception of Wright evolved, blending fear, fascination, and political commentary into a narrative that extended well beyond the communities he had directly influenced. Legal and institutional ramifications also followed. Authorities were forced to examine internal protocols, accountability structures, and operational assumptions. Training programs, oversight mechanisms, and risk assessments were re-evaluated in light of the incident. The killing demonstrated that control in theory could not guarantee safety in practice. Institutional learning became a key theme as organizations sought to prevent a recurrence and to restore public confidence. Wright's death became an enduring example of how complex interactions between symbolic figures, institutional structures, and historical legacies can challenge even the most sophisticated systems. Over time, Wright's story was interpreted in multiple ways. Within Loyalist narratives, he was often portrayed as a figure who stood firm when others compromised, whose defiance symbolized loyalty and principle. In academic and policy analyses, he was examined as a case of leadership, influence, and vulnerability within highly polarized environments. Across media and public discourse, Wright became emblematic of the unpredictable consequences of charismatic authority operating in volatile contexts. His legacy remained contested, complex, and deeply embedded in discussions of Northern Ireland's recent history. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of this legacy was the way Wright's life and death reshaped the perception of power. He demonstrated that authority can be constructed through presence, reputation, and decisiveness rather than formal office or institutional sanction. Yet his demise underscored the fragility of such power. Even figures whose influence seems absolute are vulnerable when systems evolve, scrutiny intensifies, and containment becomes inevitable. Wright's narrative became a study in the duality of symbolic authority, its capacity to inspire loyalty, and its susceptibility to collapse under conditions that cannot be fully controlled. In the years after his death, commemorations, remembrances, and discussions continued to reflect Wright's enduring presence in Loyalist consciousness. His life story, shaped by defiance, leadership, and reputation, became intertwined with broader debates about responsibility, security, and the role of symbolic figures in conflict. Educational and analytical work on the Northern Ireland conflict often references Wright as an example of how individual agency intersects with structural constraints, highlighting the interplay between personal decisions and systemic pressures. Ultimately, the aftermath of Billy Wright's death illustrates the long-lasting consequences of high-profile leadership in polarized environments. The immediate loss of life was only the beginning. The reverberations touched organizations, communities, and institutions in ways that persisted for decades. His story serves as both a cautionary tale and a lens to examine the complexities of authority, surveillance, and vulnerability. Wright's life and death did not simply close a chapter in Northern Ireland's history, they created a framework for understanding the delicate balance between influence, risk, and legacy in a society emerging from prolonged conflict.